rained through her fingers. Page 4150. Mr. Carstairs shrugged as he turned towards the door set in the wall. Oh, I'd have prevailed, sooner or later. True, he had expended a tremendous amount of power. At the end, Elaine frowned. Then why hadn't he? Mr. Carstairs looked over his shoulder, the teasing light back in his eyes. You jumped in quickly enough. After all, I knew you had bottom. Realization dawned, followed by outrage. Was that a test? She demanded. Mr. Carstairs waded away. Had to know who was at my back after all? He called over his shoulder. Elaine sputtered. You? What kind of person does that? She splashed after him, catching up near the shed. Mr. Carstairs, Ned? He interrupted. She gave him a narrow-eyed look. Mr. Carstairs is such a mouthful. If you had called out Ned, I'd have reacted sooner. Her face expressed skepticism. And we've battled together. He nodded at the poker in her hand. Calling a man by his Christian name, it was against all the rules of propriety. Still, these were peculiar times. All right, Elaine nodded. Ned, then. She fully expected him to ask hers in return. He didn't. Instead he said, Look, the water's changing. Indeed. Its color had lightened from silty green-brown to something paler, almost golden. It churned against the walls as it drained from the yard. The sound of rushing water was all about them. With the Grindylow gone, its magic no longer binds the water into a pool. I think, said Elaine, we had better leave. This will attract attention. He nodded and held out his hand. Elaine took it, only because the current had stirred up the detritus that had sunk to the bottom half a year ago. A broken cup bumped against her side. Seaweed wrapped itself around her legs. Carefully they made their way to the door in the wall. Warped and water-swollen, the back door refused to move. Mr. Carstairs, Ned, wrestled with the handle before muttering something under his breath. Elaine caught the flash of magic. Sharp and swift and golden. He pulled at the door again, and it yielded ponderously, groaning against the moving water, tearing the last of the fragile web of don't-see-me magic Elaine had laid over the house on Marine Parade. The enchantment snapped with a kind of finality, scattering in fine droplets that tingled against Elaine's face. She turned to look at the house, seeing it as if for the first time. The stained facade, the broken windows, the missing roof slates. Its neighbors down the row were in worse shape, one whose side had crumbled away, another with a collapsed roof. Her heart ached at the sight. Miss Smith, Ned stood on the other side of the wall, holding the door open as the water gushed out into the narrow alley beyond. Underneath the ready smile and laughing eyes, she thought he examined her closely, too closely, but he was the only human companion she'd had in months. No, even longer. He was the only one who had looked at her, rarely looked at and seen her, in years. Elaine, she said, gazing beyond him to the watery ruin of the city she'd once known. My name is Elaine. She squared her shoulders and stepped out into Brighton. A film of sea water covered the knot of side streets. Here and there, it pooled into hollows created by broken buildings. Sometimes it stirred exposed soil into patches of mud. Elaine kept her eyes on the ground, watching her footing. Her legs were unsure on the uneven surfaces of Brighton. She seemed to have lost the knack of handling unfamiliar ground. Besides, looking down meant that she couldn't look up and around, couldn't feel the weight of ruin Brighton all about her, couldn't feel so small and exposed under a frowning, overcast sky. She couldn't ignore the debris, though. A broken quizzing glass, handle tarnished, glittered from within a pile of crumbling sandstone blocks. A damp clot of shredded cloth huddled against a water-stained wall. Most of the houses had bled from behind their stucco facades, sand and flint and broken bricks of bungalows spilling halfway across the street. The most incongruous thing of all was the elegant chaise lounge that the sea had delicately placed in the middle of the street, as if inviting weary travelers to rest. The way behind it was blocked. Ned let out his breath in a weary puff. Can't get to St. James's this way. What a labyrinth this is. They struck deeper into the tangle of alleyways, scrambling over heaps of rubble. Cradled between them was a pool of water. Wooden dishes floated on top of it. "Drax," said Ned briefly. "Don't touch them, Elaine." "I wasn't planning on it," she responded, picking her way down the short slope with squelching steps. From the way it dragged at her shoulder, the contents of the knapsack had turned to lead. Her damp coat clung to her body, the weighted right pocket banging against her thigh. The tears, still there, Ned, she realized, was considerably drier than she was. Elaine's feet ached, her head had begun to hurt, and she was annoyed to find herself getting winded. Her daily regimen of perambulating the attic floor had clearly been insufficient exercise. Ned must have caught the disgruntled look she cast his way, despite his back being turned, for he stopped and looked back at her. Tired? No. Wet. Elaine had long accepted that moisture tended to cling to her. As a child, it had earned her epithets she did not remember with fondness. How uncomfortable. He looked around at the broken houses, sagging like half-filled sacks against each other. This way. They found a private corner where two boundary walls met. The rest of the rear yard had been washed away, and the house it belonged to was a thin shell of itself, blank eyes where windows and doors had once been. It looked ready to collapse if someone so much as sneezed in its vicinity. Elaine eyed it with misgiving. She sat on an almost horizontal sandstone slab, wedged against the wall on one side, and propped by a fellow slab on the other. With a sigh of relief, she laid the knapsack and poker to the side. Ned knelt in front of her, and brought something golden and round, the size of an apple, out of his pocket. "What's that?" she asked, feeling the tingle of magic. It was the same sharpness she'd felt earlier with the grindalow. "Something to warm you up. But don't touch it directly." He held the orb in his cupped hands. "Put your hands around mine." Elaine's cold fingers curved around his large, tanned hands, touching them lightly. Elaine thought suddenly, "This is the first time in months I've touched another person." The gesture was almost too intimate. She wondered what he thought of her slight touch. His attention was on the orb, a gold sphere with a raised, engraved ridge encircling it. Magic stirred between their hands, unfurling into yellow blossoms that dripped heat. Warmth rose up into Elaine's face, slid through her hands and down her arms, enfolded her body. She'd had no idea, until the moment warmth sank into the frozen marrow of her bones, how cold she'd been. How cold, and how lonely, how afraid. The realization was almost painful, like the silent groan of her muscles as the heat touched them. Elaine closed her eyes, her damp clothes gently steaming around her. The hem of her skirt stiffened with salt as it dried. She felt Ned shift, heard him let out a breath. Both movement and sound brought her back fully into the moment. Embarrassed, Elaine opened her eyes and snatched her hands away, folding them onto her almost dry lap. "That's enough, I think," she said, mustering her dignity. "Did that sound ungrateful?" she added. "Thank you." He looked at her silently and squarely. How unfair for the man to have such ridiculously long eyelashes. "Where did you get that?" Elaine gestured towards the magic orb, more to break the awkward silence than out of genuine curiosity. "This?" Ned looked down as if he'd forgotten it altogether. "Remember the Merlin I told you about? The ugly one?" "Yes." Elaine had a foreboding feeling about where this conversation was going. "I took it from his pocket." Ned grinned. He looked just like a boy up to a prank. A dangerous prank. "This is the Merlin's." Elaine clasped her hands together more tightly. She didn't trust anything that had belonged to so powerful a magician. Everyone knew that the Merlins had terrible arcane powers. Now that she looked closer, the orb itself did have a smug, self-satisfied air. My darling Elaine, was. I can't tell you how useful this has been to me the past decade or more. Ned's eyes narrowed. He cocked his head in a listening posture. It seems we have unwelcome visitors. Splashes came from beyond the wall, interspersed with raucous laughter and jeers in accents so thick Elaine couldn't make out any recognizable words. Ned slipped the orb into his pocket and rose to his feet. That stern look was back on his face. Elaine grabbed his sleeve. When he turned to look at her, she shook her head and put a finger to her lips. For a moment, she thought he would ignore her. Then the strain of his arm against her hold ceased. He gave her a brief nod. Right. This was her chance to prove she was more than baggage. The vapor from her clothes hadn't spread far. Elaine blinked, and the world turned grey and inward on itself. Clammy air wrapped around them both. Briefly, she regretted she had so little time to enjoy being dry. She drew her misty magic, fine as drizzle and clinging as cobwebs, over Ned and herself. From outside the enchantment, a passerby's gaze would skip right over this corner. If not, then the only things of note were a dark stain upon the wall, and a heap of sandstone rubble in front of it. If someone were to squint, they might realize both stain and heap were vaguely person-shaped, but then there was moisture in their eyes, blurring their vision. The first of Ned's unwelcome guests came around the wall. Elaine just kept herself from betraying them both with a swift, startled movement. A misshapen creature, half her size, stamped through the muddy water. Its hair was black and spiky, its skin an ashy gray. It wore clothes made of pale, supple leather, and an accoutrement of odd objects. A snuff box, a lady's fan, a fob, dangled from the rope of pearls it wore as a belt. The creature's possessions, however, didn't appear to bring it any happiness. Its face wore a ferocious scowl, and no wonder. Its two companions followed, bickering high and loud. The first wore a tattered bonnet upon its head, while the second had festooned itself with quantities of silk flowers and ribbon, as if it had raided a milliner's shop. The object of their quarrel was a china teacup that both had seized a hold of. This they now tugged back and forth to punctuate their disagreement. With a sinking feeling, Elaine recognized the cup. She had drunk out of it only yesterday. Ned said, exhaling the word, imps. The first imp now spun and turned upon its fellows, spitting out a series of short, savage sounds. It extended a hand, tipped with long, sharp fingernails the color of iron, and tapped the cup meaningfully. Its underlings, for so they seemed, cowered. One spoke sullenly, only to receive a barrage of what must be abuse. The corner of Ned's mouth twitched. He apparently understood rather more of the imp's accent. Elaine permitted herself a slight feeling of satisfaction. The imp's quarreling only made them less observant and thus more likely to accept her illusion. The imps fanned out into the yard, kicking a heap of brick here and pushing against a ruined half-wall there. Droplets collected in Elaine's hair. She breathed a light fog in the imp's direction. It curled around their legs and brushed against their faces. The imp with the bonnet pushed it further down on its head. Its fellow, now in temporary possession of the teacup, grimaced. Its teeth were small and sharpened. There's nothing to see here, so go on to the next house. The grey curtain of her charm, fragile but flexible, wavered in a light breeze. It had taken Elaine much practice to spin draperies of magic that molded themselves to the changeable world. Hardening them only created brittle shells that snapped with pressure. At last, after wreaking their tempers on inoffensive rocks, the imps left, their forms blurred through the magical gauze.